Ralph Dunning is the visionary founder behind Foreign Rider, a sportswear company built for athletes with diverse interests. Prior to founding Foreign Rider, Ralph was the founder of Dunning Golf, a company that revolutionized golf apparel for nearly 2 decades with technical clothing favored by golfers worldwide. An expert at building brands that focus on performance and sustainability, Ralph's approach to Foreign Rider, with its ethically produced clothes, appeals to those seeking stylish, high-quality gear for an athletic pursuit. In addition to his apparel brands, Ralph is also the founder of the Brand Unification Co, a leading design, creative, and strategy firm. All right, Ralph, thanks for joining us today. We've known each other, I guess, coming up quite a few years now. We've been in similar circles, so it's nice to connect again. Do you mind just telling a little bit about yourself to our audience, a little bit about your background?
When did we first meet? It had to have been close to 10 years ago, right?
Yeah, it was at like the PGA show 10 years ago, something like that.
That's what I thought. And we've both gone in really different directions in that course of time. So to answer your question, my background, I was in the music industry in my 20s. And when I was in the music industry working for one of the bigger record companies from the mid 80s to the early 90s, I started to really see how music and sports and fashion and skateboarding and the evolution of hip hop and how all these cultures were starting to drive all these really interesting areas in apparel. And at that time, I was just getting into Ironman racing and cycling, and I was really inspired by what Sean Stussy was building at Stussy, and I really respected what Ralph Lauren had built back then, and admiration for what Nike had built in the running and athletic space back then, and Timberland were making all their stuff in the USA back in that time frame. And you just kind of pay attention to all these different things. And I found in the triathlon space that there wasn't really anything that I thought had any, and I hate to use the word cool, but it was kind of like, what is cool in that space back in a sport when it was in its infancy? And so we started a company called Rip and Hammer. It was myself and my friend Steve Menzie, who came from a corporate job. And we started this little company in his house, and it turned into a pretty major brand in the cycling and triathlon space. And but that, we were both really young. We didn't really know a lot of the things that we can talk about later about culture and supply chain. And we were just 2 young guys that went to a lot of race expos and did it the old school way of getting in front of people. But I learned from that the importance of organic communication and word of mouth. And I would say 7-8 years later, I was in Hawaii. I was attending Ironman and played a bunch of rounds of golf. Hadn't really played much golf, and we were playing in cotton golf shirts from whatever we were. I think I was wearing Ashworth actually back then, because I thought that brand was pretty cool. I just bought them in the pro shop and played a bunch of rounds. And I came back to the condo and said to my wife, I'm going to start a golf company. And my wife was actually in the golf industry, and she said, well, it's all cotton and you're talking about tech. So just kind of threw my hat in the golf industry and knew nothing about the complexities of the golf industry in an era when it was dominated by cotton. And we really had to fight our way into an industry that didn't just have any idea about who the brand was and what we were doing. They didn't understand the whole tech thing. So we spent probably 5 or 6 years getting the brand going in Canada. We went down to the US in probably 2005, did a trade show, just stood there. Nobody really understood what we were doing. And then in 2007, Zach Johnson wins the Masters wearing our product, and the brand blows up and the whole industry pays attention to cotton. So we had a really good run with Dunning. And then in 2012, I sold the majority of the company to another group, and we were able to work together for quite a number of years, which is quite rare in a acquisition or joint venture. And I left that in January of 2020 to focus on this brand, Foreign Rider, and that's what I've been doing for the last 4 years, really just getting this company off the ground while working on a framework that we had built for entrepreneurs that were just trying to understand how to build a company and what branding actually meant and where the misconceptions were about branding. And that's been a lot of fun too, to work with some really big companies and to work with some small companies. So it's been a 30-year entrepreneurial journey that, to try and summarize in 5 minutes, is not that easy, but that's my 30+ year journey of entrepreneurial experience.
Can you juxtapose or reflect on the difference in kind of the first 4 years of starting Dunning, and how, like, the last 4 years must have been crazy starting Foreign Rider? I mean, just considering the macro.
That's probably one of the best questions that I've ever been asked, because you would never think to compare the two, right? And so the first 4 years of starting Dunning was incredibly difficult because people just didn't understand what we were doing from a technology perspective, that we were really a tech company. And you know what it's like in the tech space, that it takes a long time for people to understand it, but when they do, you'll see a whole industry chase it, right? And so that was difficult because you felt like you were banging your head against the wall. And once it started to get traction, then you could see results from that. Starting Foreign Rider, I left Dunning in January of 2020, and I took a 6-week cycling trip so that I could just sort of clear my head. And, you know, leaving Dunning was very emotional for me because I'd built that company from scratch. And, you know, we were very fortunate that to this day, the brand is still resonating with people. And I think a lot of that had to do with what the positioning of the company was meant to do. And if that can be carried forward, I think that that's important. With Foreign Rider, I had a really long amount of experience now on how to build a company. And I knew the importance of culture and people. I knew the importance of supply chain, but I was about to really learn the importance of supply chain. So when I was on that trip and really thinking this through, for 2 months later to deal with what we all dealt with when COVID actually started, that it was, in my opinion, there's never been a better time to start a company, because I think it was going to really show what companies were built around culture and built around defined purpose, and not just throwing purpose around like you see it on like mission statement, purpose, authenticity, words that are up on walls right now because everybody thinks that they have to have that, and they do, but it's really understanding what they mean and how they apply to everybody within your company. So when we made the commitment to do it and self-funded it and put a lot of our own capital into our own savings into using that as capital to do it, we took on a retail lease. Everyone said, this is crazy. And supply chain, as you know, had gone absolutely sideways with companies just canceling all of their orders. So what happens when a company cancels their orders? And this is where the value of people becomes incredibly important. And we talk about the value of people in our company, the value of people that we have a relationship with as a customer, and the value of the people that are in our supply chain. And all three of those silos have to work together. But supply chain, that the companies that didn't really think what their actions were doing to a factory or to a mill, and understanding that global supply chain, even though people think it's incredibly large, it's really not. That the best mills, there's not that many. The best factories, there's not that many, and everybody talks. So when these companies started to cancel their orders and it was having an impact on the owners of these factories and facilities, that we were really determined to build very strong relationships with our supply chain. And it was difficult because the availability of materials and the availability of zippers and all of these things it was a challenge that I had never seen anything quite like it before. Then we couldn't open our doors. So we take on this lease, we get our inventory, and our store is closed for a year. But what I learned from that was the value of, and we put it in a community. We didn't put it in a mall. We put it in a community, and people want to support small companies as well. They didn't know my background, that I had a couple of big brands, and people would tap on the glass and, can I look at what you guys are selling? And they were buying it through the front door. And that was amazing to see that human connection, which is something that I think is incredibly important. And it's part of the 5 guiding principles of brand unification. But what I learned from that was people are really going to drive everything that's going to happen. The importance of culture in our company and with everyone that we're interacting with, that we couldn't fake our way through that we had to really navigate through that in a very respectful, transparent manner. And I think it allowed us to survive what would have been the roughest waters for anybody as a newer startup company, even though that I had all the experience going into it to actually know how to stay calm when it was very challenging. And there were windows when it was very stressful, but I feel like if we could have just had the foundation to get through that I feel like now we can really stay focused on our goals. So yeah, very different 4 years, but equally valuable.
Do you feel like you would have had the same kind of supply chain traction or access? I know you've got a background, so you've probably got prior relationships with all the people that you work with, but without the disruption, without the pandemic, do you feel like it would have been as easy to get into these places that were maybe facing a bit of a struggle on their side?
The panic that was out there, nobody knew how to react, right? So I think what a lot of these factories and these mills, and we did everything the first couple of years domestically, right? So we were growing the cotton in the US, we were doing everything domestically, and then we got to the point where Canada and the US have a certain aspect of labor that we can depend on, and then there's certain categories that certain countries are just much more efficient at doing. So I think I've had these relationships with these factories and these mills for a long time, and I was always very conscious when I traveled to spend a lot of time having dinner and lunch with these people and getting to know the people on the floor. So we definitely had an advantage there, but I think it was the manner in which we approached our supply chain. If something went wrong, which it always does, whether it was something around fit or fabric or whatever was coming to us, that I think what surprised them was how we treated them as partners. And again, there's a word that is very much overused, but when a factory makes a mistake, if they tell us up front and we can address it together, we can both work on a solution. And what I saw from that was that dialogue started to travel around different parts of the world, that what we're building at Foreign Rider, there's a defined reason why we're doing this, and that our suppliers felt like there's mutual trust. We could trust them and they could trust us. And then word starts to spread where more and more factories that maybe were a lot bigger than where we were and the life of the company wanted to do business with us. And that experience and the patience to be able to build that, definitely, whether there would have been COVID or not, those relationships, as you said, Kane, were there. But I think it just showed they were looking for companies that they could depend on, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. I really love the image of people buying stuff through your front door, right? And,
yeah.
and did that kind of act of humanity, did it confirm what you already knew about culture, about building a brand around a purpose, or was it something new for you?
It was something that I hadn't seen since the Rip and Hammer days, when we used to stand at race expos and we were selling out of the back of the van that we were sleeping in. And that human connection back in those days in the 90s, pre anything that was digital, it was the old school way of communicating. And this was a way of getting back to that. And I really learned that yeah, digital is incredibly important, but analog and touch and feel, I think it's human nature that we want that, right? So to see that in person every day just really reconfirmed for me why certain brands that I had a lot of respect for were able to become very stable brands, like what Patagonia has built over decades, and why has Apple been so good at building such a global footprint that I'm in Taiwan and my phone breaks and shuts down and I get a black screen. What do? You drive over to the Apple store in an Uber that you have to get the hotel to call, go in, get your phone fixed, and then you can leave with your phone, right? So to me, that control, that narrative that Apple has, and I think that Lululemon's probably another really good example of that, is that, you know, there's a company, and I remember being at snowboarding conferences in the 90s when Chip Wilson still had West Beach, and watching how that company has grown by controlling the narrative. You walk into a Lululemon store, that they've built that around culture and fabric and the way they address people when they come in the store with information on materials and fabric. And I mean, now you can say arguably it's one of the most knocked off companies in the world. The amount of brands that have tried to do what they're doing, and some are having success, but you know, when in the athletic space being that competitive, are you judged by top line revenue, or are you judged by your stock price in such a competitive arena? And Lululemon's stock price that is very high, and I think that their growth is not going to be hindered whatsoever, even with all this competition. I believe that's because of that human connection they built from day one. They built a community, and they've been able to spread that through every single person that works into a location. So it was just great to see that in person over the last 4 years.
Wonderful. You built what will be an enduring brand with Dunning, but as you decided that you were going to start building Foreign Rider, are you able to pinpoint certain things that you said, you know what, I'm going to do this differently this time? And that can relate to brand equity, that can relate to whatever you want.
I think that along the Dunning journey that I definitely made a lot of tactical mistakes, that when you're growing, and well, first you're in this era of the first 4 years where you're just fighting to get people to understand who you are. And then you have a player win the Masters, and then your phone's ringing off the hook, and you've got 3 or 4 of the biggest retailers in the world that were offering us $1-2 million POs. And I said, nah, it doesn't really feel right. We want to build a golf company, and we wanted to build a sportswear element that sort of went outside of golf. And we were really early in doing that. Like we had tactical sportswear in 2009 that was meant to complement golf. But the tactical mistakes that we made of taking on that business without having an infrastructure to make sure that sell-through is going to happen at those locations. Again, back to the communication, emotional connection thing, that when you walked into some of those really big retailers, I would walk in and say, what's this Dunning brand? And the guys on the floor really didn't know much about it. And I felt like it took us away from our core focus of being a real golf company. And that was intended to be sold through pro shops and to be sold through golf resorts where we could control a little more of the narrative. So that was a really big mistake, I think, on my part to go down that road. But when there's all this growth being put in front of you, you chase that growth. And not enough growth can kill you, and too much growth can kill you. And too much growth really hurt our business. And it ultimately impacted what we were doing in golf. And I was sitting around with my dad in 2010, and I said, I'm really unhappy with the direction that we've taken this company. And we were doing pretty solid volume, but I just didn't like the direction that the company was sitting in. I didn't like what we stood for, and I just wasn't very happy with it. So that's when we started to explore. We've got a lot of brand equity out there, a lot of other golf companies were talking to us, and we made that decision to sell it. When I started to think about Foreign Rider, it was, how do we build this where we're really focused on who we are? So really understanding who we want to be as a company, having some guiding principles that are not just manufactured, but are really going to be at the soul of who we are, so that if we're faced with a hard decision, we can always go back to, well, what do we stand for and why do we exist? And if we can answer those questions with those reasons, that it made those difficult scenarios that we all face easier to handle. And the other part of it was, I felt like I had been in scenarios where I didn't really like how some of the interaction with supply chain was going on. And I really vowed to myself that we were going to treat our supply chain fairly, and that we were going to treat our supply chain the way that we wanted to be treated, no matter how heated a situation can get. And sometimes it can get heated, but in the end, man, we're just people trying to get by every day, and the pressures that people can be under. And when you see those scenarios and you can diffuse a situation because you understand that there's human connection going on here, that part for me is been something that is very valuable. And the other part of the business, knowing that we're not going to compromise on anything around quality, whether it's fabric, how we make things, if it's not what we feel is the best in its category, whether it's technical or organic cotton or Supima cotton, that we just won't do it. I will never be in that situation where I will compromise anything that we're doing for the sake of growth or trying to save money, because I think in the end you end up losing money because of that. So if we're focused on good product and we're focused on people and supply chain, and we can build a much more direct communication with the people that we want to build a real relationship with ultimately, that I think if we just stay focused on that those are things that were always in my mind, but we didn't do them, and we made a lot of tactical mistakes. And I think you read a lot of information out there about the average age of a very successful startup company now are guys that are in their late 40s and 50s, because they've been through a number of scenarios where experience really does matter, right? So, and I think that working on the Brand Unification side, when you work with a lot of entrepreneurs and companies, I feel like everyone's facing the same problems. And so as entrepreneurs or as companies, what do we do all day? We set goals and we solve problems. And the problems are always as a result of people, and people can either fix the problems or they can make those situations worse, right? So if the culture of a company is fractured, then problems are not getting solved. And I think that where I've seen problems surface now, that if people on our team can solve those problems, then we're doing a good job, and we're doing good work, and there's a difference there.
I think that was a really insightful thing that you said there around people being the root cause of most problems, and also they're the only ones really with the ability to fix it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, are you comfortable sharing, Ralph, your 5 pillars just at a very high level?
Yeah, I think that that the first part is really just knowing who you are, and having, and I'm talking as a business person or as a company, that you really have to know who you are. And on the Brand Unification side, that it's the first question that when I sit down with a company leader or a founder and say, I want to know, I will say, who are you? And they just kind of look at me, and I say, not who's your company, but who are you? Just tell me what you stand for. Tell me the companies that you really have a lot of respect for, and why. What was the first brand that really resonated with you? So I think that the fundamental of who are you is incredibly important. And I think that having the ability to build an emotional connection around who you are, what's your reason to exist, that if you go from who are you and your reason to exist to having the ability to build an emotional connection with the audience that you want, all of a sudden things start to set in motion. And I think that understanding the audience that you want to build a relationship with, you ask people, who do you want your customer to be? Well, 18 is 55, and they kind of want everybody. I think you have to really think about who you want your customer to be. But more importantly, what I think is important, Kane, is who's the customer you don't want, and understanding that there's a big difference between who's the customer you want a relationship with, clearly knowing who's the customer that you don't want. Because if people were coming into our shop, or people that we're talking to now as we're opening locations across the US, and they come in and they don't understand what we're doing, and why is your pricing more than this company but it's not as high as this, and we can explain that to them, then you understand who you want and who you don't want. And then I think that the fourth part of that is really built around what's the way that you're going to communicate with your audience. So to me, photography, filmmaking, and the type of language that you're using can't look manufactured. And I think that you could take a lot of people that are in marketing and say, well, how are you going to communicate who you are? And they'll go to an agency, and they can't really articulate to the agency what it is that they want to say. And I think that entrepreneurs struggle with it even more, because sometimes they're so in the weeds of every day that it's hard for them to step back at 20,000 feet and go through those first 3 or 4 points. But when you get to this fourth point of how to communicate, I don't feel like marketing is the right word anymore. I almost feel like marketing is trying to convince someone to buy something, where I think that communicating is a much more emotional way of building that. So if you can do that through compelling photography and compelling filmmaking, and the language that you're using really reflects who you are, then you're seeing things take even more hold of that relationship. And then I would say that the last one is having the ability to be really consistent, being consistent with who you are, but also having the ability to constantly evolve. And I think that this is where you see a lot of companies, and you can go through a list of companies that have made this mistake, but if you're consistent to who you are, you're paying attention to the people that are around you, recognizing where things are evolving to. And the golf industry would be the perfect example of that. Back in 2001, when we started Dunning, nobody was paying attention to what was going on. Brands were like, I'll never make tech stuff. I sat in some of those panels where they said they would never do it. And I would say, why? I don't like tech, or I don't understand it. But if you're not evolving to where the industry is going, and some companies actually got left behind. And I think golf is in a place right now where it's much more diverse. It's got to be much more inclusive. It's got to be more inviting to a lot of the younger players that want to come into the game. And if they're being judged because they're tatted, or they want to wear their shirt untucked, and that is the industry really evolving with where it's going, and it's changing quickly, right? So those are really my 5 pillars for what I think I've studied, just seeing patterns forming with a lot of companies over the last 30, 40 years. And what we've seen has really helped get FR off the ground. What's given us the ability to have our suppliers really trust what we're doing, because I have these conversations with them, so they really understand who we are. I don't just walk in and say, here's our designs. I have these conversations with our suppliers, so they know that this is real. There's a reason to exist, and if they feel engaged in that and connected to it, then they typically will just go to bat for you. When with other brands or other companies, they're maybe not going to do that as much.
What I like about that framework, Ralph, is that it almost mirrors one for one what we preach to our clients when it comes to the human capital side, right? Giving people a reason to come, but also understanding that you need to repel certain candidates from coming to your company. So all that stuff resonates real true. I'm going to give you some props here. One of the things that I've always enjoyed about kind of following your journey is you have this ability, or this way of taking people behind the scenes that I don't see very many founders or very many brands do. Could you just reflect on that a little bit? Is that your way of finding the right audience? Is that your way of repelling the audience that you don't want? Like, what are you thinking when you do that?
I think transparency is incredibly important, and it's been important forever. And you can study what the big consulting firms are using as terminology right now: transformation, transparency, authenticity, all these buzzwords, purpose. But do you actually understand the purpose of purpose? And so to me, transparency, letting people have a real inside view of how we do things and why we do things, and letting them know who I am, if that enables that person to feel more connected to us as a company because they get an inner look at what we're doing. And as you know too, Kane, with being transparent, that I have some views, I have a voice that I would like to share with people based on my experience, and sometimes it can rub people the wrong way. And I've been pretty vocal about what's going on in the fashion industry, what's going on in consumer behavior. I've been a little bit vocal about what's going on in golf with chemically treated fabrics, because that's incredibly harmful to the environment. I think that fast fashion and in the mass market space and fast fashion that's going on in the golf industry with prints all over this stuff that you're going to wear it for a season and get rid of it. These are things that I really am against. So to share my views on what should we be doing to prepare people in your generation for what does the future of business look like, I think that transparency, for the most part, people feel connected to it. But there are some people that have sent me some pretty nasty messages on LinkedIn. You're bitter and angry. And I'm like, no, not at all. But if you don't like it, don't read it. This is just my views on what we should be doing to prepare future generations for how the business world is going to work. And if you don't agree with me, that's okay. But all the good companies all have very similar values. So if you see good companies that are operating the same way, and that a lot of entrepreneurs and business leaders are looking for how to get their team aligned, then transparency becomes important, right? So that's why I believe it's important. And you've probably seen that in a company, I look at a company, it works in three areas. So I would say in the top half, it's split into, you have design, product, service, communication, branding. What I would say is some people would deem as the fun stuff. That's what I think was the fun stuff and still do. And then there's the operations, logistics, production, finance side that I had to learn. I was a creative person, but I had to learn the business side. And the business-minded people need to understand creative, and creative people need to understand business, at least attempt to learn how they work. And then the most important, and I'm going to say this takes up for half of the company, is going to come down to the ability to sell. And that if your sales team are out there, and everyone every day, we're all selling, right? That's how we generate revenue and sales. You have to have the ability to sell, but it shouldn't feel like selling. It should feel like communicating. But where the disconnect is, why is the sales team so disconnected from the marketing team, and the finance team is disconnected from, let's say, the marketing team, and finance are mad at marketing, and sales are mad at marketing, and finance are mad at production, and there's this disconnect in a company. But if we're working off these 5 principles that I mentioned earlier, this brand unification framework, well, everyone's working off the same purpose and the same reasons to exist. So if everyone feels connected that way, then departments become connected, then you build culture, because I don't believe a company has culture. I believe a company is a culture. And that's got to start with leadership, and that's got to start with transparency, and that transparency has to go throughout the entire company, and then everything starts to come together in a very unified manner.
Wonderful perspective. Penultimate question here, Ralph. When you reflect on your career and you reflect on some of the teams that you've built, can you point to like one or two traits that the most effective teams have in your experience?
As cliche as it sounds, everybody wants to feel, it's human nature, you want to feel like you're part of something, right? We all want to be a part of a tribe, whether it's at work or in motorcycling or golf or whatever it is. But as people, we naturally want to be a part of something. It's just human nature. And that the better teams that I've been able to build, and you make your mistakes, but the better teams that I've been able to build have been around common shared vision. So that means that the purpose and the reason to exist has to be articulated in a way that people believe. Not, we went to an agency, they came up with a fancy purpose, they stuck it on the wall and nobody reads it. But if everyone's working off a defined purpose with clarity and they feel like they're a part of that, that I think is ultimately what is going to make a company successful, because then people go to bat for each other and people have each other's backs, and there's not an alternate agenda that's sort of going on, right? Like if everyone feels like they're a part of something, then, and it's why over the last couple of years and the last year in particular, that I've been really fortunate to have incredible talent from big companies reach out to me, excuse me, that want to be a part of what we're doing because they're following the stuff that we're talking about. And that also, when we work with companies on the brand unification side and the workshop that I built this 7-hour workshop just called BU workshops. And it was really just to take people through what is the biggest problem that most entrepreneurs have when they're getting their company off the ground. And that is, they don't know where to start. They actually don't know where to start. So that's why we created this framework to say, well, here's where you start. And where you're going to start is you're going to tell me who you are. And you're going to tell me why you're building this. And you're going to tell me all the things that resonate with you. And so when you ask these people questions, what are the first 3 or 4 brands that resonated with you when you were 12 or 13? It's amazing to watch people react to that because they understand emotional human connection, because it goes back to a brand or a company that they liked when they were small, or maybe it was a musician, but there was something that triggered that emotional connection there. So if you can get a team to understand that this is how emotional connection works, to find purpose and being able to articulate that, everything just flows from there. So it's, I know that's a long answer, Kane, but it really comes down to just a defined purpose that is real.
Nope, that makes total sense. Last question, Ralph. If you got to sit across the table for dinner with, 25-year-old Ralph again, what piece of advice, what would you say to him?
That's easy, man. I would say you have to be patient, that it really takes time, that when things start to really go sideways, that's okay, that only good things come from it, even when you're in the blackest of black holes and you can't understand what's going on. But patience and remaining calm. It's taken me years to get to the point where you're calm and you have inner peace. That if someone said to me, what do you want more growing up? Do you want success and some financial reward, or do you want inner peace? Now it would be inner peace. Like if I could learn back then, the inner peace is at the center of everything. Calmness and inner peace and stillness and the philosophies that are around that, that's what ends up making, I think, a really good business person, because you're not just making gut check emotional decisions and working off revenge and getting back at people and all the things that I think ultimately take people off track, right? Is that you let your emotions get in the way of making decisions around, why is that person that you're sitting across acting that way? What happened that morning that person is reacting that way? So calmness and stillness. If I could have learned that at 25, and it's taken me, over 30 plus years to learn that, and I'm still learning that, I would have loved to sit back with that version of me at 25 and go, just relax, man, and trust the process.
Wonderful.
Because that's what it's about.
Yeah, it's great perspective, and I appreciate the insight, Ralph. I think you know how I feel about your work. I think I've always enjoyed what you do, and I am really looking forward to what you do with Foreign Rider. I think I've followed the journey since you probably started it, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you get done. Ralph Dunning is the visionary founder behind Foreign Rider, a sportswear company built for athletes with diverse interests. Prior to founding Foreign Rider, Ralph was the founder of Dunning Golf, a company that revolutionized golf apparel for nearly 2 decades with technical clothing favored by golfers worldwide. An expert at building brands that focus on performance and sustainability, Ralph's approach to Foreign Rider, with its ethically produced clothes, appeals to those seeking stylish, high-quality gear for an athletic pursuit. In addition to his apparel brands, Ralph is also the founder of the Brand Unification Co, a leading design, creative, and strategy firm.